We had a couple of birthdays in our house this week, and in fact, today is my fourth child's 8th birthday, which I'm not okay with. I really liked Maggie's 7-year-old Maggie. And I know 8-year-old Maggie will be amazing, but I like it. I like little kids. So she'll be great as an 8-year-old. But we're celebrating her birthday today. And then a few days ago on Wednesday, it was our oldest daughter, Emma's birthday, and she turned 20 this week, which makes me old. So I have a daughter that's lived 2 decades, and it's just, wow, like you're not even a teenager. I mean, it's a big deal when you first gets to be a teenager. Like some of you are looking forward to that. Some of you are looking way back on that, and that's okay too. But now to have a 20-year-old and just be like, oh, wow, we have a 20-year-old now. And I remember back, and I have this on video. I didn't try to find it because it would just embarrass her, and then I'd owe her a lot of money. But her first birthday party, we were living in Southern California at the time, 19 years ago, and we had this party in the park. And you know how you are with first kids? You're just really attentive to them, like helicopter parents to the max. Like, I don't think she even touched dirt, like her first year. She was our first child, didn't have any germs or anything like that. I don't think she ate any sugar her first year. And that's kind of how you treat your first child a lot of times. And then you get your second child, and you're just like, whatever, you know. Like, I remember with the first child, the binky would fall on the ground, and it would be like, you know, pressure wash it. You're putting it in the dishwasher, 400 degrees Fahrenheit, just to get that thing clean before you put it back in your mouth. And I remember when Caleb was a baby, he was like, it's in the dirt. Here you go. You know, give it back to him. With the rest of the kids, it's like, whatever. Just lick it off and go for it. It's tasty. But with her, you know, we were really protective. And on her first birthday, I don't think she'd had many sweets before her first birthday. So we had the video camera on her first birthday party. We put her big piece of birthday cake right in front of her, right? And it was the weirdest thing because she would not touch it. She was just like looking at it like, what in the world is this? You know, and just kind of querying it for several minutes. And we're like, come on, eat the cake, eat the cake. And you know, she reached out and would touch it and kind of back off a little bit. After a few minutes, finally we got a spoon out and, you know, like, okay, try a little bit, and she'd taste it, and it was kind of like kind of looked like that until she finally acquired a little bit of taste, and then she slowly and delicately ate her birthday cake. So a wonderful gift, wouldn't you agree, a birthday cake? A wonderful gift had been given to her, but she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Thank you, Mark, for bringing me my bottle of water. You are a true servant. He even opened it for me. Did you take a drink off of it? Okay, good. Glad you got some. Okay, sorry. So a wonderful gift had been given to her, and she just wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And then sometimes we get those gifts, don't we? Whether it's a birthday gift or a Christmas gift or that, you know, 18th ugly Father's Day tie or fruitcake for Christmas or something like that. You get that gift that you don't quite know what to do with, don't you? And if we keep that gift, we kind of maybe hide it away. You know, we say a polite thank you, and then we hide it away, and then we put it kind of maybe in the back of the closet. If it doesn't end up at the thrift store, and we put it in the back of the closet, and we start thinking about who we're going to re-gift it to. Is this just me? You get those gifts that you don't quite know what to do with, so you put them away, you try to forget about them, maybe you re-gift them. And I'm afraid that sometimes this is how we treat God's good gifts to us. Sometimes we don't know the beauty and the wonder of the gift that we have. We just don't quite know what to do with it. And so we throw it away, or maybe we put it in the thrift store pile, or we hide it up in the closet, or we think about regifting it. And this morning, I want to look at Hebrews chapter 10 because the author here is going to point out at least 3 gifts. I want to really hone in on one of them, but he's going to point out at least 3 gifts that I think we don't understand or treat like gifts very often. We don't lean into them and live with them as we should. And he's going to exhort us to see them as the good and gracious and beautiful gifts of God and live with them as such. Now, the book of Hebrews, just to get some context, we're going to look at the foundation here of these gifts in these first few verses. But the book of Hebrews is an extended commentary on Jesus and his person and his work. In other words, who he is as the Son of God who came to do the work of perfectly fulfilling the law in all of its requirements. That's the book of Hebrews summed up in a sentence, if you will. And there's two great pictures in the book that the author gives us of who Jesus is. And the first is that Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. Jesus is our perfect sacrifice. So look here at chapter 10 of Hebrews, starting at verse 19. It says, since we have confidence, so he's laying down reasons here. He's laying down a foundation of reasons why we should take these gifts as they are. Since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Now this is referring back to what's called the Day of Atonement, which was a high, holy feast in the Old Testament. You can read about it in Leviticus chapter 16, probably the holiest day of the Hebrew year. And on that day, the Day of Atonement, the high priest would go through a thorough cleansing ceremony so that he could approach this room in the tabernacle or in the temple known as the Holy of Holies, or the holiest place. And on one day a year, that high priest, after going through this rigorous cleansing, could go in through the curtain into that room and offer atoning sacrifices in the presence of God. This was a day of fasting. It was a day of worship. It was a reminder to the people of God's holiness and their own sinfulness. It was a yearly reminder of their desperate need for forgiveness, but also a reminder of God's benevolent and kind provision for their forgiveness. It was a reminder of their ongoing problem of sinning against their God, but also of God's desire to dwell with them and make a way for them to dwell with Him. So God graciously, during this day, provided cleansing and forgiveness. And that's what atonement is. That's what the word atonement means. Cleansing and forgiveness so that two parties who are not reconciled can be reconciled in relationship. And this was done in the Old Testament through animal sacrifices. But as Hebrews 10:4 says, and you can look there, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And so what would have to happen is every year they would have to go through the same ceremony, year after year after year, even daily, offering sacrifices so that their sins could be forgiven. And this is what makes Christ's sacrifice so beautiful, that He gave Himself once. So look back at verse 10 of chapter 10. Where the author writes this: we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And then look at verse 12. For when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, He sat down at the right hand of God. Why did He sit down at the right hand of God? Because His work was finished. That's what you do when you're done with your work. You sit down. Once for all, a single sacrifice. And then in verse 14 of the same chapter, for by a single offering He has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So as the perfect Son of God, Christ has purchased eternal forgiveness for those who put their faith and who put their trust in Him. His sacrifice then saves us from the consequences of our sin, the consequences of the law. So His once-for-all sacrifice saves us from death, from judgment, from condemnation. And by virtue of His perfect sacrifice on our behalf, we now not only have forgiveness, but we have access to God. It says Christ, in these verses, in verse 19, Christ has obtained a new way, verse 20, a new way that is living. He's opened up by the new and living way that He opened for us through the curtain. And by living, it means that this way is always open. It also means that the way is a new way. The way is Jesus. John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And He is this way now into the Father's presence. So this veil that used to separate the Holy of Holies from everything else is Jesus. He is the one that we now go through to get into God's presence, and He has given us access through His sacrifice, through His body and blood given on our behalf. So Jesus is our perfect sacrifice, and Jesus is also our perfect high priest. We see this in verse 21. And since we have a great high priest over the house of God. Now, in the Old Testament, the job of the high priest was, as chapter 5, verse 1 of Hebrews tells us, to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. So the priest was a go-between, an intermediary who would offer these sacrifices to God and pray for the people and go to them, to God on the people's behalf. And in chapter 4:15, it says this of Jesus, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin." Now turn to Hebrews chapter 7. Just have you turn there really quickly. Jesus is a high priest who sympathizes with us. He became human and went through suffering so he could know what it was like to be us. He sympathizes with our weakness, yet he was tempted but without sin. And Hebrews 7 tells us not only does he sympathize with us, but he is the perfect high priest. Verses 26 to 28. He is holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sin, and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So in his perfection as the Son of God, he is able not only to sympathize with us, but also to offer perfect offerings and have access forever to the throne room of God. And in this perfection, he also gives us, not just once a year, but 24/7, access into God's throne room. He gives us access to his Father. Okay, so there's a little bit longer of a summary of the book of Hebrews. But this all leads now into these three beautiful gospel gifts that we find in verses 22 to 25. So Christ is our perfect high priest. Christ has done the perfect sacrificial work on our behalf. And through this work, he has purchased for us some incredible gifts. Incredible gifts. Gifts that we should not ever expect to have, and yet he's given them to us. And these are gifts, brothers and sisters, that we often neglect. These are gifts we forget about. Or if we do regard them, we regard them with boredom and disdain. We pack them away and we put them in the top of the closet, not to be seen again until we move and have to clean everything out, or until we die. You see, I think what happens for us, honestly, this happens for me often, is that we expect God's gifts to be better than we often experience them to be. We expect God's gifts to be better than we often experience them to be. We expect his gifts to be without flaw. We expect them to be perfect. We expect them to be exactly what we want them to be. But he doesn't always give us what we want. He gives us what he gives us. But we demand that his gifts be enjoyable and easy and comfortable and rewarding and pleasant and helpful and beautiful and wonderful. We want to go to a dinner party and expect to brag about all the gifts we have in mixed company. We want people to hold us in high esteem for having them. We want God's gifts to be the way that we would prefer them to be, which is not always how they are. Yet we must take God's gifts as he gives them, not how we would design them. And at the same time, be thankful for them. We can't just toss them out. We can't just take them to the thrift store. We can't just hide them in the top of the closet. We can't just rewrap them and re-gift them and hope for something different from him. It was important, I think, and beautiful this morning that God led Dallas to call us to confess our idolatry to God, because really the nature of idolatry is, having received a gift from God or gifts from God, looking elsewhere for better gifts. That's what idolatry is. God's given me these gifts, I'll keep my options open and see if I can find something better. And that's why the author now has to not only in these few verses explain the beauty of the gifts that Christ has purchased for us through his death, but also exhort us to embrace the gifts that he's given to us and live in them. So the first gift that we see here is the privilege of prayer. Look at verse 22. Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. And when he's talking about drawing near, he's talking about drawing near to God, drawing near to the throne room because we have access. So draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith. And because of the work of Jesus, we now have the privilege, we now have the opportunity to get close to God without fear of rejection. When the high priest would go into the holiest place on the Day of Atonement, he went in hopefully with fear and trepidation. And the legends have it that they would actually tie a rope to his ankle just in case God struck him dead while he was in there. Because you can't get any EMTs into the Holy of Holies. You got to pull the guy out if you're gonna deal with the body. You can't go in there after him. So the priest would go in with fear and trepidation, and what we're being called to here is the privilege that we have to go into the holiest place without fear of rejection, without fear of being struck dead. We're told that because of Christ's sacrifice, we are holy. The high priest had to go through all these rigorous cleansing rituals. He had to wash himself. He had to offer sacrifices. He had to be prepared thoroughly to go into the Holy of Holies. And by Christ's sacrifice, we are holy. So let's read this entire verse 22. Let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. You see what Christ has done for us is he has forgiven us. He's washed us clean. He's called us sons and daughters. He has drawn us in close. He has done everything needed for us to approach him. We can't read this verse in confusion and think it says, make yourself holy so that you can approach God. Make sure you stop doing all those bad things that you've been doing or having those bad thoughts. Make sure that you stop doing drugs or smoking or chewing or eating poorly or sleeping with your boyfriend or your girlfriend or looking at pornography. Make sure you stop all those before you come to God. Come to Jesus who forgives you and come into his presence. And when you come into his presence, often and eagerly, you'll be amazed at how those things fall out of your life as you repent towards God. He has done everything needed for us to approach him. Christ's sacrifice has made you holy. You now have free access to God, so enjoy it. That's what the idea here is. Enjoy that access. What fools we are to neglect this. I mean, this is earth-shattering, world-changing, and we're foolish when we think other things are more important than coming to God 24/7 in prayer, whenever we want. Chapter 4, verse 16 of Hebrews, the author writes this, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." He wants us to come and ask. He wants us to plead for mercy because he wants to give it to us. God's made himself available to us 24/7, whatever we need for whatever reason. And at its core, this is the gift of prayer. It's the gift of close relationship with God, the opportunity to have access to the very throne room of the King whenever we want. Brothers and sisters, we have his ear. His ear is bent towards us, and he wants to listen to us. He wants to speak with us. The second gift we are exhorted to enjoy in verse 23 is the gift of the gospel itself, the stability of the gospel. Verse 23, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. That phrase, the confession of our hope, is simply the doctrinal content of the gospel, the truth of the gospel, who Jesus is and what he's done. That we not only accede to in our minds, but that we put our faith and our hope in. It's the proclamation of faith and allegiance in the reality of Jesus, in him being our hope and our salvation. It's the confession that this word is true and fully true, and we can trust in it. This is believing God's promises, the truth that the Scriptures and the future hope that we've been promised will happen, that they are real, and we can trust that, we're told here, because of God's faithful character. I was listening to that song Oceans this morning on my way in, and it dawned on me there's this phrase in there, I'm probably going to butcher it, but it says, you've never failed and you won't start now. God's not going to start failing tomorrow. He's not going to start stopping keeping his promises. He's not going to stop keeping his promises tomorrow. He's faithful. He always has been, and he ever will be faithful. We can know that what he said is true, and that what he has told us about our future will take place. But we live in a culture that pressures us on every side to water down, whitewash, and make our confession more palatable to our culture, fit in. Don't say things that are offensive to other people. We're tempted to do this from every quarter, and sometimes we're pleaded with to do it in the name of love or in the name of tolerance or equality or justice or whatever it is. But because God is faithful, we too must be faithful as we hold fast to the truth of the gospel and not to the world's version of the gospel. And the stability of the gospel is a great gift that we should walk in. Now, the third and final gift, and really what I want to focus this on this morning, is the third gift that we see in verses 24 through 25. Let us consider, the author says, let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Throat doesn't give out. And what is being described here in these verses is the gift of Christian community. The gift of Christian community. And if we're going to live the life Christ has lined out for us, even in the midst of discouragement, even when we're persecuted or oppressed or pushed at from every side, even if we're in the midst of despair, if we're going to live the life that Christ wants for us, we need each other. We can't do it alone. The Christian life was never meant to be lived solo. We need the church, and the church needs us. But oftentimes, I think we find ourselves at a distance from the church. We find ourselves frustrated, or disillusioned, or hurt, or angered, or just plain cynical about the church. So what we do is we withdraw from Christian community, or if we do engage with it, maybe we keep it at arm's length. But what these verses do is that they urge us to take the gift of community seriously. These first words, let us consider. Let us consider. What those words imply is intentionality. So to live in true, authentic Christian community requires that you and I be intentional. That we actually think about it. That we consider what it means and what it means for us and to us. That we pray about it. That we talk to God about it. That we make plans. That we set goals. That we jump in. It's like going to the gym, right? You have to make the time. You have to take the effort. You have to spend the money. You have to get up early. And you have to invest, be intentional, consider the fact of what you want. I want to be healthy. I want to be strong, whatever that thing is, and you have to intend to do it. You have to jump in. And in the same way, it will take something for you to live in community. It will take something out of you to live in community. You will have to be intentional. But what are we to be intentional about? What is he asking us to consider? Here it is. Let us consider how to stir up one another, or how to stir one another up. Now, the word here for stir up can also be translated stimulate or provoke. It's the very same Greek word you may remember that was used in Acts chapter 15, verse 39. You guys all remember that sermon, right? This is the sermon where this was the passage where Paul and Barnabas got in a disagreement. And it was a violent disagreement. And the author, Luke, used this very word, paroxysmos, where we get the English word paroxysm. It's like an upheaval, a violent. It's a word packed with energy and aggression. Often it's negative, like in Acts 15, where there's conflict, anger, violence. There may even have been punches thrown. I don't know. But here in this verse, it has a positive connotation, a vigorous activity and movement. In other words, when we consider how we are intentionally to enter into Christian community, it's to be a vigorous and active moving, as a vigorous, active, moving vessel, like stirring up a fire or fanning a flame. And if we're honest with ourselves, I think we tend to often be dulled by the magnificence of God or the difficulties of life. We're dulled to the beauty of the world that we live in, the wonder of the gospel, the gifts and the promises that he gives to us, that we have in him. And this dullness, which is often very prevalent in ourselves and in those around us, is deadly. So the question is, will you take action to stir up and stimulate, to provoke your brothers and sisters in Christ so that they don't remain dull? Do you need that from them? Do you feel a dullness settle in your life with Jesus? You need your brothers and sisters to consider how they might stir up and stimulate and provoke you to what? Let's keep reading. Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works. Love and good works. These are expressions of obedience, act of obedience, expressions of faith as we seek to live out the greatest commandment, to love God and to love others. And the wonderful thing about stirring people up to love and good works is that when you practice love, when you act out good works, doesn't that stir other people up? And when you see them doing that, doesn't that stir you up and encourage you and provoke you to do the same? And when we stir each other up to these, we call people to live a life of faith that goes outside of themselves, rather than a life of fear that is bent inward on themselves. Stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together. It's important that we come together, that we gather together to do this, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. And to encourage is literally to put courage into something. And these aren't just empty words. It doesn't mean just like applauding for somebody as they walk by, but it means walking alongside each other, equipping one another, empowering one another, supporting one another, praying for each other. We need each other to live out a life that is impossible without one another. The life of faith that we are called to live daily as followers of Jesus, we need help in it. And if we attempt to go it alone, we will lose courage. We will despair. We'll become misguided. We'll get distracted. Maybe even we'll fall away from the faith. Encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Now, the day being referred to here is the last day, the day when Jesus will come back and set all things right. And in a sense, we live in the last days between Christ's first coming and his second coming. When the kingdom is now, we have the gifts and the blessings of God's kingdom, and yet we still live in a fallen world where the kingdom is not fully yet. And in this world, in this day, in this dark and evil day, the last day, it's difficult to follow Jesus, and yet it's imperative that we remain faithful to him, even when persecution and difficulty and opposition come at us. And the role of the church, the role of Christian community, is to help us to stay faithful in these last days when it's so difficult to do. To survive as Christ followers in these days, we must accept these gifts that Jesus has won for us. And not just accept them, but flourish in them, delight in them, walk in them. And the church is one of those gifts. And quite honestly, I think if we were all honest, we would say the church is one of those gifts that God gave us, and sometimes we want to re-gift it because it's not quite what we expected. You think of all the things you dislike about the church, all those things that are awkward, make you uncomfortable. Greeting time. The elders would say announcement time. All the reasons you can think of to critique a church. All the reasons you can think of to leave a church. These may actually be the very reasons that God has you in a church. They are all a part of the gift that God has given you. You can't reject those things without rejecting the gift itself. You see, verses 24 and 25 here, two of the most important verses in the New Testament, do not describe a church that exists for you. They don't describe a church that exists for me. They do not describe a church that fits all of your preferences, whether it's the music style or the preaching or the comfortable building or a nice kids ministry or people that look like you and act like you and have the same beliefs or desires that you have. The church pictured here is one that provokes you, that stirs you, that stimulates you. You guys like to be provoked? Most of us don't. But the church pictured here is one that provokes you to love and good works. It provokes you to action, to obedience. It expects you to be present for the other even when it's difficult. It's the church that expects you in the midst of conflict to press in, not run away. The church described here is the one that presses you to holiness, to mutual giving and receiving, to following Jesus, to loving others sacrificially, to dying 1,000 little deaths to self every day in order to meet the needs of others, not of yourself. The church described in these two verses is not a comfortable church, nor is it a convenient one. And if the church that serves our consumerist preferences and our personal comfort is not the one described in the Bible, then why do we give such weight to all these things when we choose a church, or when we attend a church, or when we don't attend a church? You see, our search for the perfect church that meets all of our preferences and makes us comfortable is actually idolatry. That's not the church that Christ wants to give to us. Now, I want to go into a top 10 list, actually. And I'm going to put this entire list in the first person because this isn't just me pointing my finger at you. This is the pronoun that we need here is the I. And some of these will relate with you and some of them won't, and you'll probably think of others, and this is not a complete list, but as I think of looking at the scriptures, I think of Christian community. These are 10 reasons that I need Christian community. And perhaps they'll encourage us to live in the Christian community more than we often do. First of all, I need Christian community because I cannot follow Jesus alone. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Proverbs 27:17. I need others so that I can become more like Jesus, so that I can grow in holiness. If you're trying to sharpen iron in the air, it doesn't work. You need something to sharpen it on, and we need each other to help us follow Jesus. Secondly, I need community to remind me of the gospel. I too easily forget what Christ has done for me and who he has made me to be. I forget that I'm a sinner saved by grace, that there's nothing I can do to earn or lose God's love. I forget that I have access to God, that I have justification, that I've been accepted by him, that I have hope in Jesus. I too easily forget these truths when left to myself. I need my brothers and sisters. I need you to remind me of the gospel. I need community in order to thrive under authority. God has made us to live under authority, however chafing that might feel to you. God has made us to live under authority, mainly his own authority. And as a member of a church, I willingly submit myself to the authority of other believers, to your speak-in and authority in my life. And in that, I choose not to live autonomously, in other words, as a law unto myself, being my own authority. And in so doing, I learn to thrive under and enjoy God's authority over me. I need the church in order to thrive under authority. Fourth, I need community because I am self-centered. Without others, I rarely need to make sacrifices. I rarely need to die to my preferences. I never need to put the needs of others above my own if I'm not in community. Every single one of us Americans is a trained consumer. We've been trained to consume. And when I only involve myself in a community that meets my consumerist preferences, then I lay nothing down for Jesus. Living in community helps me to love others more than I love myself, more than I love my comfort, more than I love my preferences. Number 5, I need community because I have an enemy. We are in a battle, but when we isolate ourselves, we're vulnerable to the wiles and the lies and the traps of Satan. And spiritual warfare happens best in community, where brothers and sisters have my back. What a deep encouragement to know that others are praying for me. Don't you love it when you know that others are praying for you when you're in the midst of a battle? We have an enemy. We need each other. Number 6, I need community to help me value the image of God in everyone. See, the church is a diverse group of people who, thankfully, are all different than me. Believe it or not, I would not want to be in a church of just me. That would scare me to death. But because of my sinfulness, because of my impatience, these differences will often rub me the wrong way. They'll get on my nerves. They'll bug me. But in the right light, what I will see when I look at someone who is different than me is that I will see God's beauty in each unique individual. But I can only see that if I'm with you. I can only see that if I'm rubbing up against you, if I'm in community, if I'm in relationship with you. And I want to see the image of God in every single one of you. Not just take my pick of the people that I like. Number 7, I need community to help me pursue the glory of God. I need others to help me, and this is a quote from Brett McCracken, who I'll reference in just a minute. I need others to help me look outside myself to Jesus. And being involved in the church reminds me that my life isn't about pursuing my own success or my own achievements. Rather, my life is about pursuing the glory of God. That's why God made me. But left to myself, I forget this. And I'm tempted to use God's glory to further my own success rather than vice versa. And what the church does is it helps me to say no to my own agenda and to pursue God's agenda. Number 8, I need community to help me persevere and not give up. See, other believers encourage me to keep on going, to put one foot in front of the other when life is discouraging. And remaining faithful often seems beyond my power, but I need brothers and sisters who encourage me in my weak faith, whose faith is strong when mine is weak. And I need them especially to help me persevere in community, when sometimes it would be easier just to pack up my bag, give up, and go to the next church down the road. Number 9, I need community because of suffering. There is nothing worse, would you agree, than suffering alone. And God's gift of community is given to support me, walk with me, remind me of a kingdom perspective in the midst of suffering. And I am to be that same gift when you are suffering. And then finally, I need community so we can show the world Christ's love. I'm going to bang on Gabe's drum for a minute here. Christian community is missional, meaning that we are to take the gospel to the world on mission as sent ones. But that isn't just in the message that we proclaim, but in the way that we live differently than the culture around us. So when the world looks at us, they should see a kind of love that is so different than anything they've ever experienced that they can't help but stand back and go, wow, God must be in their midst. This is the kind of love that is shown when we stick together when it's uncomfortable. The kind of love that's shown when we sacrifice for one another. The kind of love that has real world traction and appeal because it is so different. That's my top 10 list. A little bit anticlimactic there at the end, but that's okay. We need community. And you can add to that list whatever, but I hope, if nothing else, it spurs you on to remember that the community of the church that God has given us is a tremendous gift. And I pray that we would not neglect it, but that we would lean into it and learn in the midst of community to become more like Jesus. That we would stick with each other even when the going is tough, even when it is hard. And I'm going to give you just a few points of application here. And in the month of October, you're going to meet all of our home community leaders on Sunday mornings. They'll come introduce themselves to you. We have 8 home communities that meet throughout the week. And home communities are a way where you can get with a group of people and get to know them at a different relational level than you ever can on a Sunday morning. These home communities are important because of that, because they give you the opportunity to actually live in community with other believers, even when it's difficult. So I would encourage you to dip your toes into a home community, check some of them out, and commit to being part of one. My prayer from the beginning of this year is that we would have 2 new home communities by the end of the year. And God's bringing it down to the wire. Okay, it's September now, so we have a few months. But I'm praying for 2 more. And the reason for that is we want to make room for everyone to be involved in a home community. And to do that, we need more homes, we need more leaders. And so pray with me, if you will. The next thing is I have a book. I didn't write it. This guy, Brett McCracken, that I talked about. It's called Uncomfortable. And we're going to have some copies of it available starting next week. Or if you have Amazon on your phone, you could probably have this on your doorstep by the time you got home today. It's called Uncomfortable: The Awkward and Essential Challenge of Christian Community. And his thesis is basically that church is awkward and difficult, and yet it's essential. We need the community. And I'd encourage you to grab a copy and read it. It will make you uncomfortable, the book will, but it's helpful in getting us to wrestle with what it means to be part of God's community here. And then finally, I want to invite you again to come and celebrate with your imperfect family next week. As we gather together, as we sing and pray and give testimony, and as we eat chili and pie and play games together in the afternoon, come and be with us. We're going to focus next week not on who we are or who we aren't, but we're going to focus on Christ and all that He's done, because He deserves all the glory. And we need you to participate with us. We need to be in community for that, so I'd encourage you to come and celebrate. And now I want to invite you to something that we celebrate every week called communion. It's called communion because it's done in community. We come together as the people of God to remember the sacrifice of our great high priest who gave his body, represented by the bread, and his blood, represented by the juice, so that we could have access to our Father. So come. excuse me, if you are a follower of Jesus, this is a meal for you to remember the access that you have to God. And if you're not a follower of Jesus, we'd encourage you just to listen to God right now. Open your heart and your mind to what he might be saying to you. And one of us would love to talk to you if you have any questions. Let's pray together. Father, as we come to the table this morning, we're reminded of the great work you have done on our behalf. Reminded of the great sacrifice you made. We're reminded of the perfect life you live. We're reminded that you became like us because you love us. God, you made us, and as we look around the room at each other, we see your image in each other. And God, I pray that we would lay down the idols of our preference and our comfort to embrace something much more real, much more valuable, much more beautiful, much more messy, and yet much more glorious, and that we would give you the glory in all of it. Thank you for your church. Thank you for your people. Thank you that we can encourage each other, that we can sharpen each other, that we can stimulate and provoke and stir one another up to love and good works. In these last days, Lord, where life is hard and difficult and all these things are pressing in on us to push us away from you, God, we pray that we would be for each other the encouragement that we need to keep on after you. And may you be glorified in our midst as we celebrate you, as we rejoice, as we pray, as we live life together. Pray all this in your name. Amen.